Yes, yeah, and so I will, and I'll get into that a little bit later as well, but yeah, I will talk about kind of the schedule and stuff too. And kind of the overall course dynamics a little bit later, after we have finalized this. So yes, Monday it would be due at 11:59 p.m. So I'll give maybe another 30 seconds or so to give everyone a chance to answer. So for the question about the employee ID or Baruch school ID, you shouldn't need that for Top Hat. For Top Hat, you should just be able to do, in the meantime, to use the text feature. Yeah, and if you're having trouble seeing the question, I would just say text in the meantime, and that way your answer will be recorded. And you'll still get full credit as well. And let's see. Yeah, so I'll get into the access code and stuff and how you get access to Cengage as well a little bit later. Yeah, and so you are totally able to submit early. Like this is just basically when it would be due. So when the latest it would be due. But yeah, I always encourage students to submit early, just because I know being a student myself, stuff happens. And if you wait till the last minute, I usually find that for me, usually bad computer related stuff happens. So, okay. Yes, yeah. So the latest time to submit, that is what this question's asking. So you can do it way before this, but this would be basically the last time to submit it. Okay. I'll give maybe another couple seconds, and then I will stop so we can move on. Actually, I'm curious. Let's see the responses so far. Okay, so it looks like most people prefer Tuesday at 2 p.m., which totally makes sense. So why don't we move to, and so I will update the syllabus with this information then. So why don't we move to the next question then, which is, let's start. So what day should the post-lecture quizzes be due? So this is the day, and we will get to the time of day in the next question. So this is just when should the post-lecture quizzes be due? Yeah, and so this is also about the latest time to submit them. So we will get to the time in the next question. This is just purely the day. Okay, and I'll give maybe another couple seconds. So if anyone who has not answered wants to answer, definitely answer ASAP, and then we can move to the time of day. Yes, so actually last semester that was what, last semester basically what happened was students actually preferred the day before for the post-lecture quizzes. So I originally had them due on Sunday, and students actually preferred having them due on Saturday. So that's why I wanted to make sure that I was giving everyone the ability to actually choose the dates that they prefer. Yeah, and so there will be, most weeks will have a pre-lecture quiz, post-lecture quiz, and homework. And I'll get into kind of the more detailed part of the syllabus after we wrap this up. Okay, so it looks like everyone has answered. So I'm going to stop it. Okay, so overwhelmingly Sunday. So they will be due on Sunday. So then for the final one, we are going to do the time. So when would you like the post-lecture quizzes to be due? What time of day? And so I figured most students last semester wanted them due later in the evening. And they ended up settling on 6 p.m. So whatever time you all prefer works for me. The quizzes, so they're not too long. They're maybe like between 4 and 10 questions. So I will send out an email with the updated due dates for the pre and post lecture quiz. So yeah, there's nothing due yet, so don't stress out about that. This is just to make sure that I'm being responsive to what you all would prefer for due dates. Yeah, and the quizzes are all multiple choice. And no worries, if you forgot to answer one of the polls, as long as you answer one, that's not a problem. And yeah, so for the quizzes, you can definitely turn them in early. I usually suggest that, but just this is basically the last possible second to turn them in. So that's what these due dates are for. Okay, and I'll give maybe another couple seconds to answer, and then I will stop and we will start going through the syllabus. And no, so the quizzes are actually the average of your 3 attempts. So you get 3 attempts for the quizzes, and it is the average of those 3 attempts. Before, when we used to teach this class in person, we actually did the highest, but students' grades got a lot higher on the quizzes when everything was online. So we moved it to the average of the 3 attempts. Okay. And okay, so 11:59. Okay, perfect. So I will update the syllabus then. I will let you all know when I do that, and I'll post it on Blackboard. Okay, so why don't we go through the syllabus then? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again so you all can see my syllabus. Okay, yeah, and so the question about if you do really well on the first attempt, then you can just totally ignore it and not do it again. You do not have to do all 3 attempts. If you do really well on the first attempt, don't even bother doing another attempt. I always say, like, if you get above like an 85 on the first attempt, don't even bother redoing it. It's not worth it. Okay, so hopefully everyone is in the right class, which since it's an online class, I'm assuming that's a lot easier. So the biggest thing that I wanted to say is about the office hours. So the office hours, I'm available pretty regularly. So like if you have a question on anything, I'm always very, very open. And if you have anything like class related, grade related, like questions specifically about the homework, like please email me and I will, I'm always very responsive to emails. I promise to answer them within 24 hours of you sending an email. And if you want to set up office hours, please just let me know. I'm very responsive, and we can work out a time to talk about, anything as far as the course. So that is not a problem. So I see there's some chatter just really quickly too about the average. So basically it's the average because the prior semester, everyone was getting like 90s on the quizzes and we always try to shoot for like a B minus. So that's actually another really good point that I'll mention. The Baruch College requires that the average grade in this class is a B minus. So we always try to modify everything to make sure that that's the average grade and the median grade as well. So the quizzes last semester, the grades were much too high, and we are taking the average of the three attempts rather than the best attempt. So that's why that changed. And so for the for MindTap, this is the big thing. And definitely if you do not have MindTap yet, you want to make sure that you get MindTap as soon as possible, because that's where the homework and quizzes are all through. So that's how you get your homework and quiz points, is through Cengage MindTap. There usually are curves on exams, and it is definitely possible to get an A. I have at least 10 to 20 students every semester to get an A in the course. It's just that the median grade has to be a B minus. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll usually say, like, just kind of not to scare anyone, like most students, the B minus grade is how just kind of most students end up with something either quite a bit higher than a B minus or a B minus. It's definitely not, there's a lot of students like with C minuses or like Fs. That's very, very uncommon. Yeah, and that's just something the department does. That's basically like a department standard. They require all of us to have that as our median. Yeah, so for MindTap, there is an unlimited subscription. I don't necessarily have like a kind of, I don't have a preference for that. I know that some students have said that they had this like unlimited subscription for MindTap where they could like get it that way. And if you got it that way, that's totally fine. But just make sure that you don't pay more than the special Baruch price, because for Baruch and on, oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, then that's totally fine. If it was $0, then that's great. So for the class, basically, you'll just want to follow the MindTap registration, and basically each chapter in MindTap, which I will show you right here. So this is kind of an example. And what it normally is like, there will be, so chapter 4, and then there are required materials. So everything in the required and graded materials, you're required to do that. Anything in the additional practice problems and related materials, you don't have to do that. So if you are struggling or having kind of a challenge with certain concepts in the chapter, I always suggest that students do the additional practice problems and related material. But if you go through the required and graded material, which are the homework, the pre and post lecture quizzes, then, and you get, you know, a 90 or above, then you don't need to worry about doing the additional practice problems. And so I already talked about Top Hat. And so I see there's some chatter just before I move in. Yeah, so if you paid like more than like $84 for Top Hat, or I'm sorry, not for Top Hat, for MindTap, please contact the Cengage people through, and I can show you the link right now, because there's a special Baruch price. And so I don't want any student to overpay for it. So in Blackboard, there is the Cengage technical support. So if you paid more than like $84 for it, because it should not be that expensive. It shouldn't be more than like I see a couple of students saying it was around 120. That's definitely more expensive than the Baruch price. So if you do see that, please contact Cengage technical support and tell them that there was an issue with you registering, because you should not have to pay. It's basically just the ebook and the MindTap section is all you should be paying for. So yeah, so if there's anything, like if you did pay too much, please contact them. And if they are unable to help you, please loop me into the conversation, but they're usually pretty helpful. Okay, so let me jump back to the syllabus. So just kind of a general course schedule. So this is basically kind of how the course is going to work. We're going to move pretty quickly. So if there are like sections that you're struggling on, please let me know and we can kind of do, I can give you either additional problems or you can meet me in office hours and we can kind of work through those sections. So just, general course, I will fill these in with the dates that you all voted on, and I will post this to Blackboard. I will also post this to Blackboard with the dates as well. So that will be the dates that you all decided on. The question, so basically the way class is going to work is I divided you all into 2 groups. And so I did that for a couple of reasons. Is basically because last semester I found that it was a lot more helpful to have the class in kind of 2 different sections, just because then students could ask questions and it could be a lot more engaging. So in Blackboard, you're going to see you're either in group A or group B. So in Blackboard, if you're in group A, we're going to meet on the days that group A meets. So these are the days that group A meets. For group B, we're going to meet on these days. So group A and B, we meet on separate days. So the entire class is never actually going to meet on the same day until the review for the final exam. Yeah, so it'll be on Blackboard. So all of the groups are going to be in Blackboard, and I'll email everyone to just to let them know in Blackboard. But yeah, it's just basically, so what we're going to do is I will basically, for this, so for the first meeting for group A, just kind of as an example, what I'm going to do is I will be reviewing chapters 5 and 7. And so I'm kind of combining everything. And then, so for half of the class, I'm going to do like a mini lecture. And then for the rest of the class, I'm actually going to be answering questions that you submitted before class. And so that is this section right here. So 5% of your grade is going to be basically what'll happen is it'll be for submittal. And so the classes that we'll basically be meeting on, so basically oh, let me see actually really quickly. Yeah, so for the classes, we're actually just meeting on Tuesdays. I apologize if that was confusing. That's the due date for your questions to be submitted. So the groups are going to meet either on Tuesday or the one Tuesday or the following Tuesday. So group A will meet one Tuesday, group B will meet the next Tuesday. So basically what's going to happen is I'm not going to be meeting with every single student every Tuesday. I'll be meeting with half the class. So half the class one Tuesday, half the class the next Tuesday. Yeah, and so it's basically, we'll have class every other week. So one group will meet, then the next group will meet, then the following week, the next group will meet. Yeah, so if group A meets on next week, so I'm meeting with group A next week, group B, I'm not going to be meeting with you next week. I'll be meeting with you the following week. And so I'm going to update all that information in the syllabus with the due dates, and I will send that information out to you all. Yeah. And so the reason why I'm doing this is just because the prior semester, it was really hard to kind of get everything engaged and make sure that people were actually like not actually getting the content of the course. And so we'll be meeting via Zoom. And the top hat questions, which I'm going to talk about now. So basically same material will be taught to group A and B. There will be nothing different between the groups. The only thing that's different is before the class, each student in each group is required to submit a question via Top Hat to me that they had about the prior chapters. And then I will go through those questions and then combine them into kind of areas that I think we should go over, and then I will spend half of the class period reviewing the top hat questions. If you don't, so if you don't have a question, usually there's a question that someone's going to have. And if nothing else, it can be even just a question like, hey, I saw this news article and there was a question on economics and I thought it might relate to the class. It can be something like as simple as that. And so it's really, really basic. You don't have to think of like super complicated questions. It's just more to make sure that like I understand areas that students are having a problem with. And so it's basically every other Tuesday that we're going to be meeting. And it will be the same lessons. The only thing that'll be different is it's going to be the questions that your group asks. That's going to be the only difference. And so you're all going to submit questions, and the students will basically be kind of driving the lecture, which is kind of what I'm hoping for. And so, yeah, I will be sending the revised syllabus because the dates are now chosen. So you all voted on the dates. And so the dates and times that homework is due, I will be updating. And so for the quizzes and stuff, I'm going to update all of this and I'll send it out based on the dates. And the questions will be submitted through Top Hat. And so I'll actually go over that in 1 second. And so for the grading, the big takeaway for the grading is I tried to make it a little more not fully based on exams. I know we still have to put a lot of weight on exams, but I tried to make it a little more variable. So students will have the ability to kind of, if you're not great at taking exams, there are some opportunities to increase your grade. And so for the extra credit, so extra credit is basically if you attend all 6 of the class meetings, you can get up to 2% extra credit on your final grade. So that's for the extra credit. And so the exams, yes, the exams are always on weekends. That's just a department policy. The exams are always on Sunday. And the times are, we do actually have the times for those. So the final is at 8 a.m. and they're all going to be online. And the 2 midterms are at 2 p.m. So if you do have, if there is any conflict, please send me an email ASAP. The department is very strict with exceptions. So if there is any sort of conflict, please send me an email ASAP if you are unable to make it to the exam times. And I can try to work to see if we can switch it. Usually what happens is students who are unable to attend the exam on Sunday, they have to take the exam on Monday. Yeah, so yeah, if you do have a conflict, please email me ASAP about the exams. And yeah, exams are totally open book. You know, they're online, so I, you know, am not going to expect, you know, that you keep your materials closed. I think that's unrealistic. Yeah, and so if you are not in a group on Blackboard, please email me also. Everyone should be in a group, but I think maybe a couple students who just registered probably are not in a group. Yeah, and so the due date for the group questions on Top Hat is Monday, so that's correct. And for the group questions, so every student in that group has to submit a question to get credit. So that's the way the group questions work. Only the final is at 8 a.m. The midterm is at 2 p.m. Yeah, and so for the questions, it can be literally any question. Preferably like for the Top Hat questions, what it's going to be is basically if you have like a question about the material, that's obviously preferred, but like if you don't, it can be anything related to economics, just, making sure that you're kind of thinking through the material. Yeah, and if your group doesn't meet that week, you will watch the recorded lecture that I post. And so if you do have classes on Sunday, definitely let me know. Like if you have exam exceptions on the Sunday times, please let me know as soon as possible, so we can try to work that out. The recorded classes, no, that's not required. Attendance is not required for the recorded classes. And for the recorded classes, basically what I do is I just am going to post them to Blackboard. I encourage students to watch the videos, but if definitely don't have to. And so your group is on Blackboard. And the exam times are listed. So for the midterms, it's at 2 p.m. and the final, it is at 8 a.m. Yeah, and so the homework and quizzes are going to be due on the dates that we provide us. Yeah, so that's going to be true for everyone regardless of your group. The due dates for the homework and the quizzes are going to be due at the same time regardless of your group. So I will post this to Blackboard. And so if you can email me with your exam exceptions, that would be great, because I do have to document that. And so, yeah, so basically what I'll do with those top hat questions that you submit before your scheduled group meeting time on Tuesdays, is I will just look through them and I'll pick out some of the similarities, and I'll usually answer about a third of the questions, just because I think a lot of times like there are individual questions that students have that it's hard to know how to answer them properly. And that's kind of what those are designed for. Okay, so this is just kind of generic. I talked about office hours, but just once again, I really encourage students, if you have any sort of questions on the class or your grade or any of the material, to please schedule office hours. I'm very flexible and I try to make myself available, based upon your schedule. So if you do have any issues, please let me know. Okay. So I will then update this with the due dates and I will post it to Blackboard probably this evening or tomorrow morning. And I will send out an announcement as well with the updated syllabus. Okay, so now I did want to go and try to just cover a little bit of chapter 4 before class ends today. So for chapter 4, we're really talking about just supply and demand. So very simple. Before we can talk about supply and demand, though, we need to understand what a market is and what competition is, because this is really what the class is based on for a significant portion of the maybe first 2 months. Is there is a market that is any group of participants who have the desire and ability to trade with one another. And the competitive market is where there are many buyers and sellers. So that just means that there are a lot of people who are buying in the market and a lot of people who are selling in the market. And so that's really important, because the market and perfect competition is how basically how we assume everything is in this class for the first couple months. Okay, so for demand, demand is the buyer side. And so you can think of demand as being something that, like, as a consumer, I am a buyer. The curve for the demand curve is downward sloping. And so what that means is as the price increases, consumers demand less of the good or service, which makes sense. Like if I wanted a coffee from Starbucks and it was $10, I would probably only buy one. But if it was only $5, I would probably buy 10. So basically, as the price decreases, consumers want more of that. Supply, on the other hand, is the producer side. So this is like companies like Apple, companies like Starbucks, companies like McDonald's, and supply is an upward sloping graph. Oh, and yes, I will answer. I see there's a bunch of chat questions, so I will answer those right after I'm done with supply. And so the last thing for supply is just that note as price increases, producers supply more of the good, which makes sense. Like if you're Apple, you want people to pay $100 for a phone or $1,000 for a phone. You want them to pay $1,000 because that's how you make more money. Okay, yeah, and I can go back up to the prior slide. And so yeah, these slides are actually already posted in the chapter 4 part of Blackboard in the required and graded materials. Yeah, and let me just make sure because I saw there was a bunch of questions, so I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Yeah, if you have any like weird Cengage issues, it definitely should not be 120. Because yeah, I see a couple of people saying, so if you do have like weird issues with the price of Cengage, definitely email Cengage support. And then if they are unhelpful, please email me because yeah, the price should be pretty consistent for all students. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and so the recordings will be posted to Blackboard. Yeah, and it could be the, I saw a student mention that, and that I think that may be true if you do have other courses, because I know our price is just based on our individual course. So that could be why there are a bunch of things. And so, okay, yeah, I do see a question, and that's actually a really good point. So why don't I really quickly pause from this and go into the chapter 4 folder in Blackboard, just so I can kind of show you all what is in there. Okay, so chapter 4 folder. So there are 2 folders here in Blackboard, the required and graded material and additional practice problems. So additional practice problems, you don't have to do those, totally optional. Required and graded material. So this basically has a couple different things in it. So these pieces right here, these are the required things that you need to do in MindTap. So I will not be going over these unless you have questions that you either email me or post them for the student group questions in Top Hat. So the slides are going to be here. And then I also usually post a couple like example problems, just kind of as like additional help. Usually these problems are based on exam questions. So kind of a little hint that if you are looking for good exam practice, these problems are really good. And then I also do a tutorial video of these problems. So I have a video tutorial here where I basically go through step by step and solve these example problems. And then these are just additional video sections in MindTap that you are required to complete. So they're basically just kind of short little videos, like this one's 3 minutes and 49 seconds that just briefly go over a topic. So, and this is basically how every Blackboard folder is going to be structured. So it'll be the chapter, then the required and graded material, additional practice problems and related material. And so you basically just have to do everything in this. Obviously, like the example stuff here, you don't have to complete that. it's just kind of a helpful additional help. If there are, kind of, if you do not have a lot of experience with algebra, I usually do a lot of algebra specific problems because this class does have a decent amount of algebra, not a ton, so don't worry, but there is some of it. So yeah, so this folder is not considered all homework. So like note here, you have the pre-lecture quiz for chapter 4, and then you have the post-lecture quiz for chapter 4. So basically this folder is just all of the material that you're either required to review for the course or it's going to be graded. Yeah, the quick quizzes are homework. Usually I don't grade the quick quizzes because they're just kind of like to make sure that you've kind of reviewed some of the basic chapters. And yes, there is a due date. I will post due dates and update them based on the responses that you all had in Top Hat. So yeah, that's why there's no due dates for the homework yet. So yeah, so the due dates will be posted. I'll post those later today because you all voted on the due dates. So the due dates will be starting next week. So there are going to be no due dates this week for anything. Yeah, and so let me just make sure for this question. So so for example, so let's say, so next week group A is meeting, not group B. So if you're in group A, you are required to post basically a question in Top Hat, which is here. And so you'll see, you won't be able to see this yet, but basically you'll just have to post a question here. And this will be the due dates. I'll assign them based on what you all voted on. Yeah, so yeah, it's basically any kind of like chapter question you have, or if you don't have any chapter questions and you just read like an interesting news article and you're like, hey, I'm curious about this. So yeah, it can be any question about the chapter or just like economics in general. But what I really encourage for students to use this discussion post or to post for the group questions is basically what I encourage you to do is like if there's a question in MindTap that you are having a lot of problems with or you don't understand, post it here and then I will go over it in the second section of your groups class. Yeah, so I don't have a problem if you all want to do a group chat. Technically we're not supposed to, as faculty, in the past, there have been issues with cheating on those apps, so we are not supposed to directly encourage use of them. But if you all want to use them for like homework questions and stuff, like that's totally fine, and I have no problem with that. Just one of those things that like keep in mind that like I have heard that there has been cheating through those things, so like I'm totally fine if you use that for not cheating, but a suggestion to not cheat via WhatsApp would probably be good. Just in general, don't cheat, but if you do cheat, try to not do it on something that there is a lot of evidence for. Yeah, so in Top Hat, you're not going to see the questions right now because I have not posted the due dates. So that will be something that I'll post afterwards. The quizzes are not timed, so you have as much time as you want to answer them. So feel free to take as long as you want. And as far as like the postings and stuff, so for the, let me just make sure I understand the question. Yeah. So definitely, even I know it kind of seems annoying, like even if you don't have a question, um, you still do need to post something to the in your group chat, just mainly because I find that encouraging students to post is kind of a good way to help me understand where students are, maybe not fully understanding something. And so like if you did not have a question at all on the chapter, if there was maybe even a section that like you had to think about a little bit longer, um, I would even say just post that. Like even if you still got the question right, but you were like, hey, I'm not sure, or I had to think about it a little bit, you can post that. That's totally fine. Because I'm not expecting you to like, do a bunch of outside research for this question. It should just be, a pretty easy, like maybe 5-10 minutes, like, hey, I have a question. Why is demand downward sloping? Like, that's a simple question that you can ask. So kind of something like that. Okay. So let me pop back then to the lecture. And I'm going to try to speed through this. So we talked about demand, we talked about supply. So the next thing we need to talk about is the willingness to pay. So for willingness to pay, all we're really talking about is just a buyer's willingness to pay is basically just the maximum amount that they're willing to pay for a good or service. And so what that basically means is like, if I'm willing to pay $2,000 for an iPhone, but it only costs $1,000, then I'm going to buy an iPhone. But if I'm willing to pay only $500 for an iPhone, then and the iPhone costs $1,000, then I'm not going to buy an iPhone. So basically, willingness to pay is just how much you want to pay for a good. Skip that because that's pretty straightforward. Okay. So the next big thing is the law of demand. So the law of demand is basically just kind of the idea that quantity demand of a good falls when the price of the good rises. And so that makes sense because we saw with the graph of demand that when the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded of a good goes down. Yeah, and so like hypothetically, and that's actually good. So for like willingness to pay, so if you're only willing to pay retail price for a PS5, but you can't find it at a retail price anywhere, then you're not going to buy a PS5. So like if you could only find a PS5 on eBay for like triple the price and you only want to pay retail price for it, then you're not going to buy one until you can find it at the retail price. So yeah, that's exactly exactly an example of the willingness to pay concept. Okay. And then the biggest thing, the biggest thing that is kind of important with demand is that there's something called demand curve shifters. And so imagine that the demand curve can move from like here to here. And things that cause that are basically called there's a shift in the curve because something other than price is causing the curve to shift. And so there are a bunch of different things that can cause that. And I'm not going to go into every single one of them. But here's an example of what that looks like. So let's say that the number of buyers in a market increases. So what that means is now at each price, there are an additional quantity demanded of the item. So notice on the gray curve here, before the price was $6 and quantity demanded was 6. Now, after the shift of the demand curve, there is going to be an increase in quantity demanded. And it looks like it's going to be at 11. So there has been an increase in the number of buyers in this specific market. And kind of the best way to think about the kind of little what is a shift in demand is, so I have this little chart here or table that gives you the kind of different variable and what that is causing in the demand curve. So for example, if price changes, that's causing a movement along the demand curve, whereas number of buyers causes a shift in the demand curve. So just kind of a nice little table that I would highly recommend that you use on the exam. So that is kind of the piece for demand. So then obviously when we're talking about demand, we also need to talk about supply. And so for supply, the same process unfolds, but it's different because remember, for supply, it's on the producers. So it's people who are producing the good. What is causing them to shift? And so for example, let's go to the shift. So things that can cause shifts in supply are basically somewhat similar to demand, except they're for producers rather than buyers. And so we have the shift like for input prices. So for example, let's say that you are making your General Motors, the car company, and you're making a car. And one of the inputs into that car is steel and aluminum. So if the price of steel and aluminum go up, that means that the price of making a car has increased. And so because the price of the car has increased, what that means is basically there's going to be a shift in your supply curve. Okay, I see someone had a question on slide 23. Yeah, so, okay, so let's draw, and I can actually give an example of what that would look like. So we're saying we want to draw a demand curve for music downloads. So what happens to it in each of the following scenarios? So let's say, okay, so we have our normal price and quantity. And so then we have our demand curve. Okay, so if the price of an iPod falls, is that going to be a movement or a shift in the demand curve? And so remember, for shift is kind of like this one area over here, movement's the separate area. So they have two different pieces. So for the price of an iPod falls, what is likely to happen in that case is that it's actually going to be a shift. And the reason why is because this is the market for music downloads. So because this is the market for music downloads, what's going to happen is if the price of an iPod falls, then that's actually going to impact the demand curve for music downloads. Okay, let me, okay. Yes, yeah, exactly. So it is considered a related good. That's exactly correct. Does anyone else have questions on that for the related good? Because that's actually a really, really important piece. Okay, so someone said it would shift to the right for scenario A. Okay, so let's work through that process. So if the price of an iPod falls, that is going to likely increase demand for music because more people can buy iPods, so more people are going to want music. So that's exactly correct. that would mean that demand would increase and it would shift to the right. So yeah, exactly correct. And so why don't we then, I'm going to stop sharing this and then start sharing the top hat questions. So why don't we go through oh yeah, I can really quickly draw what that would look like. So basically, not necessarily. So it would depend on how the shift works, but you will not need to be concerned with that yet. So yeah, definitely don't think about that yet. Just kind of think about how the shift works. But yeah, so let me draw what that shift would look like before we answer a couple questions. So we have quantity, and we have price, and we have demand. And so if demand is going to shift to the right, what that means is that demand is going to move over here. And so that's just demand, the new demand line. So that's basically what happens when demand shifts to the right. And sorry, my drawing is terrible on the computer. But that's kind of what the general process looks like. Does anyone have any questions on that, kind of the process? I know we're moving pretty quickly, but does anyone have questions on like what that process is or why that process works? Yes, yeah, so demand, and remember, so this is the market for music downloads. So because the price of an iPod falls, that's gonna make people buy more iPods, which is going to increase demand for music downloads. So because that increases demand for music downloads, demand is gonna shift to the right. That's exactly correct. So we are not dealing with supply yet, just demand. So we don't know anything about supply, but that's a very good question. Good question. So Q right here, and let me highlight that. So Q stands for quantity, P stands for price. And so this is kind of like, I'm sure you'll become very tired of graphs like this, because this is basically what we'll be doing for a significant portion of the semester, is we'll be looking at graphs of the price, quantity, demand, and then also supply, which we have not gotten into yet, but we will. Yes, so that's also a good question. So a movement where the line does not shift. So what happens with a movement is, let's say the price of music downloads decreases from this point, point A, to point B. That is a movement along the line rather than a shift. So it's moving up and down the line because it's the price of that good. So this would have to be caused by the price of music downloads. Yeah, so for, let's say next week, okay. So let's say next week, no, so I will be combining in the like mini lectures that I'm doing. I'll be making sure that you all are getting the same content so no one's missing anything. The only thing that'll be different is the last part of the class, which will be the individual questions that you all post. Yes, okay, so let me make sure I understand the questions. Yeah, so basically a movement along the line only occurs in one situation. So a movement along the line occurs if the price of the good itself changes. and I'll say that one more time, if the price of the good itself changes, that's the only thing that causes a movement. Everything else is a shift. Yes. I'll caveat, so quantity in this case is basically, so in this case, quantity is just demand. Normally when we have graphs like this, it is going to be demand and supply. But in this case, it's going to be just demand. Yeah, so it can, depending on what is on the graph, it's going to be demand, supply, or supply and demand. Yes, yeah, that's exactly correct. Yeah, all lectures are going to be recorded. So each group has the ability to see the other group's questions, which I think is really helpful. And last semester was really useful. Yes, that's exactly correct. So if the price of music downloads changes, that's a movement along the graph. For the video questions, I think I believe you have 3 tries for that as well in MindTap, but I can double check that. Yeah, so scenario A again was the price of iPods falling and impacting the demand curve for music downloads. Okay, so I'm going to jump back in to the lecture really quickly because there's just one more area I wanted to touch on really briefly, because always ends up being that there's never enough time. So, oh, no worries. So the slides are up right now, and so I am on slide 36. And I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about it and then move to the next section. So for this summary, it's just kind of helpful to think about like the things that affect supply. So you have, similar to demand, the price causes a movement along the supply curve. And then you have the other pieces of supply that are shifting the supply curve. So I would suggest after class just kind of reviewing these specific expectations or the specific kind of pieces again. But yeah. Hint that this is also an important piece, and I would recommend that you keep this with you. This will be useful. Okay, so I'm not going to do this question, but there is an answer for the question in the slides. So the other thing that I wanted to say was just the equilibrium quantity. And so the equilibrium quantity is where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. And so in this instance, we have the demand and supply curve intersecting at a price of $3 in a quantity of 15. So this is, in this specific market, this is the price and quantity for this whatever good it is. Yeah, I don't think there's an acronym. I'm trying to think, because a couple students have asked me that before, to remember supply and demand shift, and I've never been able to come up with one. But if you think of one, please feel free to share it with the class, because that would be great. I've never been able to come up with one that's kind of like fun and catchy. But so for equilibrium quantity, the important thing here is that the equilibrium quantity occurs when, notice, the quantity demanded and quantity supplied is equal. That is where equilibrium quantity occurs. Not necessarily. So that is a good question. And that is going to depend on what the question is asking. Because remember, for every demand and supply shift, Demand can shift, supply can shift, but they don't have to shift together. And they also don't have to shift in the same question. So there's not necessarily a shift, an equal shift between the two. That doesn't necessarily happen. Okay, so I'm going to jump past this really quickly. And actually, I want to show you all, and the final piece today is going to be the algebra example, a different algebra example, but still an algebra example nonetheless. So let me share that with you really quickly. Okay, so hopefully you all can see my screen. So this is an example of one of the algebra questions that you will likely be asked at some point in the class. And so for an example, I just kind of wanted to walk through how this question would read. So the question is, what is the equilibrium price in the market for pomegranates if demand is represented by the price of demand is equal to 140 minus 4 times the quantity demanded, and supply is represented by the price of supply is equal to 60 plus 8 times the quantity supplied. So that's kind of the setup you're going to see for supply and demand algebra problems. And this is how you solve them. So the first step is you're going to want to find quantity. So what you're going to do is put the demand on one side and the supply on the other side. And you're just going to solve for them. So you're going to take the 4Q and add it and subtract 60 and subtracts 60. So then what you're going to do after that is you're going to have 80 equals 10Q, divide by 10, divide by 10, and that's going to give you 8Q. So importantly, we have the quantity, but now we need to find the price, because remember, the question was asking for the price, equilibrium price. So what we need to do is we then need to find price. So you have two options for finding price. You can either plug it into the demand or supply. Totally up to you. Both are correct. Importantly, I would suggest plugging the quantity into both, because that's a good way to make sure that you get the correct price. Because if these don't equal one another, that means you've done something wrong. These always have to equal one another at this point in the class. If they don't, something has gone wrong. Okay. And yes, yeah, I do see someone pointed out correctly that that is supposed to be a 6, which I have in the equation, but I did not actually remember to change this. There we go. Okay. So does anyone have any questions on this? So the lecture slides are on Blackboard. Yeah. And so if anyone has any questions, I will stick around after class for a little bit, because I apologize. I feel like there's a lot of material to get through on the first day. And so I always try to kind of move quickly. But yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to stick around. and raise your hand and I can talk to you. Otherwise, that is it for today. So yeah, so the whole content for chapter 4 is going to be due next week. I know that sounds like a lot. It actually isn't as much as it seems. And the big pieces, if you go to MindTap, you'll be able to kind of work through that pretty quickly. So I would say that like if you start on MindTap today and kind of just spend a little bit of time, it shouldn't be that challenging. No, nothing is due this week. I would say though, definitely start chapter 4 and 5 this week because it's going to be due the following week, but nothing is due this week. So yeah, have a great rest of your day, and I hope the first week of classes go really well. And I look forward to seeing Group A's questions next week. Cheers.